Hey, before we get started, we just want to let you know that this episode is brought to you by Church Sound Made Simple. Mixing sound seems complicated, but it doesn't have to be. Cut the overwhelm by getting access to the stress-free, no-fluff training that will help you create great sound at church. Visit churchsoundmadesimple.com.
Welcome to the Collaborate Worship Podcast, where we help you create great sound at church. I'm your host, Cade Young, and today I'm here with Tim Lucas. How are you doing, man?
Good. Thanks for having me on the podcast today.
Hey, man, I'm really glad that you're here. And for those of you who don't know Tim, he has been leading worship for more than 20 years. He's also the founder of worshipdeeper.com, where he empowers worship leaders to lead their congregations in deeper worship. So, Tim, give us the backstory. How did you and why did you start worshipdeeper.com?
Yeah, it was kind of just for myself to start when when you start leading worship at 15 or 16, you kind of miss some of the why. And so you can get into 20 years of worship leading, and then you wake up one day and you're like, wait, why am I doing this? Like, what is this doing? I know like it's serving a purpose. People are singing in church, but like, what's the why? So one of the first posts I wrote for the website was, how does the Bible define worship? And it was just kind of like this deep dive study looking at the original languages. Like, what does worship mean? How does the Bible talk about it? Like, in what ways does it reference it? And so I actually learned a ton. I actually just reread that post in preparation for this podcast. I was like, oh, this is some good stuff, like some stuff that I had forgotten. Like, worship is, I don't want to go too deep into it, but worship is referred to as bowing down, like almost every time it's mentioned in the Bible, which I thought was really interesting. Something we don't do a lot, maybe in church, maybe you don't see it on the YouTube videos of elevation or something, but it's literally like putting your face to the carpet, that's kind of what worship is. So that was kind of the reason I started, just to learn more about worship myself, force myself to learn the why and the how. And then it turned into, writing kind of more how-to for other people, how to get started. Because I was really fortunate to have a mentor when I was in that like younger high school age that kind of brought me through getting started. Because I think that's probably the hardest part of being a worship leader. Where do you find your opportunities? How do you get up to the skill level where you can actually get in front of people? All that kind of stuff. So I kind of addressed some of that, and then started talking about like, what are some popular worship songs? And those posts started getting popular too, because I think people are always looking for new worship songs, especially fast worship songs. So it kind of just evolved from there. But yeah, it just started just me wanting to learn more about the how and why of worship and how the Bible defines it. So that's about it.
Man, I could totally relate because I started leading worship when I was 15 and a half, I think. And I didn't even know why I was doing it either. Although, I felt the call and the pull to it, but that's about as far as it went. And I'm still uncovering, like, what does it mean to really worship? And it's interesting when you go out and study it, because you'll find out that even serving other people and serving them well is a form of worship to God. Like, there's so many different ways that we worship. In America, we just think that it's all about music.
It is. When I started, it was probably like the mid 90s, and you would never like walk into a Walmart and see a worship album. And now it's kind of hit mainstream, like where probably some non-Christians have heard a lot of worship songs like Oceans, that has like, who knows how many millions of views on YouTube and stuff. It's like a very encouraging song that I'm sure non-Christians pick up. Like, this is a great, encouraging song. When I was, there was like, when I was a kid, there was like Maranatha and like these really just hokey worship songs that were out there, and nobody like would listen to it unless they went to the church and they knew the song from their church. So it's really changed, but and that's good. But the drawback is that people kind of correlate worship with music, and it's actually just a slice of the pizza. It's not the whole pizza. And worship, like you said, could be serving somebody else or cleaning a toilet in your church, or could be just anything if you're helping the kingdom of God and serving God through that action. So,
yeah, good stuff, man. Well, in every podcast interview, we always take a moment to bring a failure out into the open so we can laugh together and learn something along the way. Because the truth is, we all make mistakes, and they seem really heavy kind of when you're in a silo by yourself. You feel like you're the only one that makes mistakes. So we like to bring these out in the open so our listeners can realize everybody makes mistakes. So fess up. Tell us an embarrassing story.
I probably have too many to mention, but I think one of the things that was kind of consistent through the first maybe 10 years of leading worship was just my voice was just very unstable, and it had a tendency to crack. And so especially on like the part of the song where it's like all the instruments drop out and the voices keep going, that's like when my voice would crack. Like, so it would get the reverb effect on it, and everybody in the room would know that my voice cracked, and like, what was that? Like, that sounded terrible. So I can't remember, like, I'm sure there's like, tons of examples. But just imagine like in front of maybe like 200 adults in the, Sunday night service that's being led by the youth. And I was up there like maybe 18 years old or something. And then I'm leading a song, and all of a sudden this big crack comes over the microphone and, through the speakers. And, that's when, your face turns red and you're like, oh no, I wonder how many people heard it. And everybody heard it. So, I just learned that, I guess something to learn from that is just that you should get the right training and get that right. Whether you're a vocalist or instrumentalist, learn how to avoid those things, because it's not really about the embarrassment that it brings to you. But if you break the atmosphere of worship because of something that you're messing up on consistently, you need to correct that. And so that you can, not distract other people's worship. But there's so much like that. And there's one time when I remember, in my home church that I grew up in, I was leading worship. It's probably like, a few years after, I left home and stuff, and was coming back to help like the youth group or something, and was up there and, just had like loose sheets up on the stand, and I was playing and everything. And all of a sudden, like a wind came in the back door. I don't know if there was a door open or something. And all the sheets just like floated down. Like everybody could see that I just had like 10 sheets like fall off the music stand onto the ground. And then I was like, well, guys, I don't have any music. We're going to see how this goes. I'm not going to pick it up. We're just going to freestyle. And so I just went off into whatever songs as best as I knew them. But actually, it turned out to be a pretty powerful worship time. But that dread of like all your music just being spread across the floor and not having memorized the songs. God used it, but it's just like, okay, now I need to put them in the binder. And then eventually we got into iPads and stuff where that's not going to happen as much, except your iPad could die or something. But that's another kind of embarrassing moment. I remember just like all my, just like a bunch of papers kind of floating down like feathers across the stage, and then being kind of irreconcilable because it would take me 5 minutes to put them all back in order. So that was another fun time.
Man, your first story like kind of brought back some bad memories.
Yeah.
Early in my worship leader years, I thought I was a good singer, and I really wasn't. And I didn't know until like I listened back to recording, because back then you really didn't record much of anything. Mm-hmm. Somehow somebody had recorded me and played it back. I'm like, that's me? Like, that's what I sound like? And that set me off on a journey of kind of like getting a microphone and some headphones so that I could like listen to what I actually sounded like and become a better vocalist.
Yeah, I think that's another good point. Is just like you have to record yourself, because you can't really tell what you sound like on an instrument or on voice unless you record it and listen back, and you can kind of compare it to what pros do, and then you realize that, oh, I'm not as good as I thought I was, and my voice isn't quite as strong as I hoped, and I'm kind of pitchy. When you're watching American Idol or The Voice or something, and they're kind of pitchy, like, oh, they had like a quarter note off on that one note. And, and you're kind of judging them for that. But then if you record yourself, you're like, half a note off of half a step off of, 3 or 4 notes, and you don't even realize it. So it's definitely easier to judge other people than yourself.
Yeah. And here we are like in the age of where everybody is live streaming their services now because of COVID. And it makes me wonder how many people listening right now, like, won't go back and even listen to the recordings from the live stream because they hate the way that they sound.
It is like, especially when you're looking to a live stream, the sound isn't as good as it would be like in a church auditorium, because you got the acoustics, you got some stuff covering it up. But then when it comes online, you're listening to these little rinky-dink speakers. It's like, that sounds way worse than I thought it would. What I thought it did. So yeah, but it's good exercise to listen to yourself, even on that, because then if you can kind of listen to the lowest common denominator, if you sound good there, you sound good pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, so there's a bonus tip for you. Quit hiding from those recordings.
Mm-hmm.
Face the recordings and get better.
Exactly.
All right, man. So let's talk about the challenges of being a new worship leader, because let's be honest, when you're a newbie, it's kind of overwhelming. So what do you remember most about being a new worship leader?
I think those who start, especially when they're younger, I know there's a lot of, 25, 35-year-olds who are starting to lead worship, and it might be a little bit different for you. But for those of us that started when we were 15, 16, in the high school time, you're self-conscious about how you chew gum, right? Like you're like, you're concerned about everything that you do because you think everybody's got you under a microscope. Really, nobody really notices you're there, but you feel like you're under a microscope in front of everybody. So if you're self-conscious about how you walk in the room as a 15-year-old, imagine like getting up in front of everybody and being the center of attention and doing something very difficult, like playing an instrument and singing at the same time and trying to lead people in worship. So that's incredibly, it's a very hard multitask to pull off, even in your own room, let alone in front of a bunch of people. So I think the biggest thing I remember is just being self-conscious, like, what are people thinking? Like, how am I sounding out there? Am I just totally a terrible musician? Are people making fun of me, like after service and all that? And probably none of that happens, but that's how you feel when you're up there. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I remember the most about kind of being a new worship leader. So if you are a new worship leader, no matter what your age, you're going to go through that. So just know that that is a totally normal part of the process.
Yep, totally normal. And like the faster you can move past that, like the better off your life is going to be. Because I remember, like in your 20s and your teens, you're self-conscious about everything. And here I am, I'm 32 now, but I'm also a dad of 4 kids, and being a dad kind of like grows you up and all kinds of stuff. And like, I'm probably self-conscious about a few things now, but it's not very many things. And it's just such a better life just to live without that always in the back of your mind. Like, what do people think about me? Like, I'm to a point where it's like, it really doesn't matter. Like, as long as I'm doing what God called me to do, then I'm being obedient. And that's what matters.
Yeah. And I think there's no shortcut to that either. So, one thing that I would say is just that repetition will take care of a lot of that stuff, because once you're super confident in your skills and what God's called you to do, like you're saying, you're not going to be as self-conscious. You're going to be like, well, if somebody doesn't like it, number one, I'm doing the best I can, what God's called me to do. Number two, they're not up here, so they really can't cast judgment. Let's see them get up here and try it, and then they can say that I'm doing a bad job. But I mean, that's a little bit more negative, but in the back of your mind, you're like, well, at least, I'm doing what God's calling me to do. And so that's all I can do. But yeah, just repetition, getting up there, leading worship 100 times there's really no substitute for it. Some people pray, God, help me not to be nervous. And where's a Bible verse that I can read? Or where's a 12-step program that I can go through to not be self-conscious anymore? And there's nothing like that. All that you can do is just get up there and just hammer away at that self-consciousness time after time. And after you do it 100 times, you step down from that fight or flight response, that like kind of primal, like, I got to get out of here type of feeling. And it just becomes normal to you. But there's no shortcut to that except just raw repetition.
Good stuff, man. Although I'm sure they were looking for a shortcut.
I wish there was, because I don't know how many times when I was a kid, I was like, God, if you could just make me not nervous for this, make me not nervous. It never worked. Like, I was still nervous when I got up there until I had done it 100 times. And it was like, okay, well, God answered the prayer, but it was like 100 times later. It wasn't that night, So he's going to answer the prayer, guys. Don't worry, but it's going to be a long process. But that's just how God has set things up. If he, just you have small beginnings, right? You shouldn't knock small beginnings. You shouldn't be like, I'm not good enough yet, so I should quit. No, you should keep going because you're going to get better. So there's just a lot of lessons to be learned no matter what you're doing, whether it's worship leading or something else. Preaching is the same way, I'm sure, although I've never done it. But, once you do that 100th sermon, you're going to be way better than you were when you started. So just keep at it.
Yeah, so I think if you want a scripture that goes along with this, one that came to mind was like the whole fan into flames, your gift, your calling that's on your life. Like, dig into it is basically what that means, and practice it and get good at it, because God gives you, like, it starts off, He gives you a gift, but you got to develop that gift. So dig in.
Yeah.
All right, man. What are the most common mistakes that you see new worship leaders make?
Repeating what we were just talking about, just like lack of the right preparation. A lot of people just expect to get up there and nail the song the first time, but you got to really put that time in at home. And
Wait a minute, you got to practice at home.
Yeah, it's this weird thing. You can't just like get up there and practice during the rehearsal. We made a point at my church to call the pre-service run through the rehearsal, not the practice, because you're not practicing your instrument at that point. You're rehearsing what the service is going to be like. You have to actually practice what you're going to be doing at home. So set up a little thing at home that kind of mimics what you're going to be doing at church. In fact, go into your church or wherever you're going to be leading worship or playing your instrument and try to do it in that space, because that helps too. But it's just basically like going through that motion 100 times on your own before you get up in front of anybody, so that when you do get up there, you're not thinking about that. It's kind of automatic, and you can focus on leading worship and playing with other people and, creating a worshipful flow. So yeah, lack of preparation. Another mistake, I don't know if this is a mistake or not, but just like having a false vision of what it is to be a worship leader is a big thing. So I think a lot of people think that 99% of what I do is going to be getting up there and on stage and performing and singing and playing and all that stuff. It's actually about 5 to 10% of what you do as a worship leader. And a lot of new worship leaders don't realize that yet. But, Kate, I'm sure that you have, this 90% of stuff that you do behind the scenes that nobody ever sees. You're picking songs, you're practicing, like we said, you're setting up tech stuff, you're programming a laptop, and it's all in service of that final product, but it's kind of unseen. And so, like, I think a lot of people think that I'm just going to get up there and be this big star and do the stuff. And it's like, actually it's mostly just like tilling the soil, and then once you till the soil for 9 months, then it's harvest time and you can actually get up there and reap what you've sowed. But if you haven't planted anything and you try to get up there, you're going to get up there and you're not really going to be very effective in worship leading. So I would just say, it's just like, nose to the grindstone. Most of the time as a worship leader, you're going to get paid nothing for a ton of work. And eventually, something might happen like a full-time gig or a part-time job as a worship leader. But, there's a lot of work that goes into it behind the scenes for years before anyone ever notices that you're doing anything. So just like keep that in mind. Kind of reminds me of a situation I had with a young musician. He was about 15. And so funny story, like going back to the having somebody that wants to kind of be the star. He had like these visions of like being kind of a star musically and stuff. And to my surprise, like he was a prodigy, man. Like he got up one like Wednesday night during youth group, and I was like, "Hey, do you think you could try playing the drums during rehearsal?" He's like, "Sure." So we played through the set. He played the drums. I mean, not perfectly, but enough. Like he had never played drums before. He sat down and played all the songs and good enough to make it happen. Right. So I was like, okay, this is a prodigy I'm dealing with here. This is amazing. This is like the thing you dream about as a worship leader, like some kid that just like comes in off the street and like can just nail these instruments first time without practice. So, and I asked him like, hey, how did you learn to play the drums? He's like, oh, well, I've played the video game Rock Band before, so that's how I know. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Like that doesn't help, does it? I think he was just really good. So anyways, he had like a lot of visions of doing it, but he had no work ethic at all. So he didn't do that 90%. He didn't practice at home. He never showed up for rehearsals. He didn't show up for the Wednesday night youth groups, nothing like that. So I couldn't use him. Like I was just like, I would love to use him. But he just never shows up for anything, right? So he just didn't understand that 90% of the work of being involved in a worship team or leading worship, for that matter, is just like nose to the grindstone type of stuff. So it was sad because he could have been maybe the greatest musician I've ever worked with, and potentially the greatest musician in my city or state. I mean, that's how good he was naturally. He just had no concept of putting in the work. So kind of sad, but that's just kind of how it goes. So yeah, just, learning that leading worship is that a lot of background work that nobody ever sees.
The sad thing about that story that you told is like often that person that has all that talent will intimidate the person that will put in the hard work. And so it kind of demotivates that person. So I bet there's somebody listening like to this podcast right now that is that person. Like you look out and you see a bunch of people that are more talented than you are, but you are willing to put in the hard work. And let me just like give you an encouragement. Like you're the one that's going to make it to the finish line, because just like anything in life, you have to put in the work to get to the destination. If you're a farmer, you have to you have to till the ground, plant the seeds, wait, water them, do all that stuff before you even get to eat anything from what you planted. It works like that with everything.
Yeah, exactly. And it's perfectly aligns with the story that actually happened in that youth group. Is that we had one kid that wasn't talented very much at all. Like he had really not very much musical talent. But we used him because he was there. And so he's the one who ended up learning drums. And, for the first 6 months, he would have the snare in the wrong spot. He would have it and it would throw everybody off. But he was consistently practicing at home and showing up to rehearsals. So he's the one who actually ended up playing drums for youth group and then eventually adult church, because he just showed up. And even though the result wouldn't have been as good as this super talented guy, this is a guy that was putting in the work. So he's the one we used.
Yeah, and I recently did a message at our church about the parable of the talents. And if you study that out, like you'll come to the conclusion that God expects us to multiply. Like he gives us all gifts, and some people get like a greater caliber of gift or more gifts than another person. But when you get, to heaven, he's not going to be like, do you have as much as this other person? No, he's going to ask you, did you multiply what I gave you? And that's the only thing that's going to matter. So if you're looking at yourself and you're like, my gift is a lot smaller than this other person's, well, stop comparing yourself, first of all, because comparison is a trap. And just say, this is what God gave me, and I'm going to multiply it, and I'm going to make the best of it.
Right.
Sorry to get out there and preach, but it's on my heart.
No, it's great. Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, you have a certain amount of talents, what God's given you. And, there's some people that have medium talents, but they end up doing just like these amazing things because they're just putting in the work, like 24 hours a day, just grinding away at their skill that they want to improve on. And there's some people that are super talented that just flame out and they don't do anything with it, which is, really sad, but just have to decide which one you're going to be.
Yeah, man. Good stuff. Well, when you're a new worship leader, there's all kinds of things that you got to learn. You got sound and bringing the team together and just like everything. So if somebody's like brand new and they're just like, man, I don't even know where to get started. Like, what do you think is the most important thing for a new worship leader to learn first?
Yeah, I mean, beyond the obvious, like learning your instrument really well and learning some theory and like how do you do certain chords and certain positions and different things like that, whether that's guitar or piano, or keys, I should say, since not many people play the actual piano like I did when I was a kid. But learning your instruments, learning, getting the training and stuff like that. But I think one of the biggest things that is a shocker for most new worship leaders who play in a live setting is that they really don't know how to play with other people and stay on the beat. So what do I mean by that? So when you're playing a song, when you're listening to a song on the radio, or let's see, since there's no CDs anymore, how do I do this? But when there was CDs back in the day, you listen to a CD and it would skip and it would get off beat and then it would start and you're like, oh wait, I have to stop singing and then join back with this CD. Or maybe, okay, in today's language, your internet goes out while you're listening to Spotify and it cuts out for a second and then it restarts and you're like, oh wait, I got to stop. So there's this beat that's like every song you hear on the radio is done to a metronome, right? They say 100 BPM and they stick to that the entire song. There's probably some exceptions out there. I've actually recorded a song where I sped up on purpose throughout the song. So there's probably some stuff out there like that. But most of the songs are going to be at 100 BPM or whatever BPM all the way through. And if you get off that, it for any amount of time, you're going to like whoever's singing along is going to have to stop singing. It's going to disrupt the flow of worship. So I would say at home, play to the recording. If it's in a different key, there are some software out there to change the key into the key that you're playing so that you can play along on your instrument. Get a little metronome app on your iPhone, something like that, and just play a song all the way through and try not to stop, right? So even if you mess up, you have to keep going and keep playing and maybe skip a chord and go jump to the next chord. Don't feel like it's written in stone that you have to play every chord there. If you miss one because you weren't fast enough to get there, just skip it and go to the next, because it's more important for you to stay on the beat and keep that song flowing all the way through than to, oh, I got to go back and miss that chord. Because if you stop singing, and then everybody else has to stop singing, and it disrupts the flow of worship. So that's part of it. Another part of it is like just being able to play with other musicians. Because if you're sitting there playing at home, we've talked a lot about practicing at home, which is great, but you also have to learn how to play with other people. So if if you're playing behind a worship leader or something, and he throws an audible, like, oh, let's go back to the chorus instead of the verse here. You have to be able to adjust what you're doing and not be so attached to the music. So that's another thing, is just like staying on the beat, making sure you're singing all the way through without stopping, and making compromises in your in what you're playing to make sure that you're going all the way through the song. I would say the other thing is what we touched on also is just like, it's more of an attitude thing, is just be available. Like, I'm not the most talented singer, songwriter, guitarist, keyboardist, anything like that out there. I'm pretty medium as far as all that stuff goes. The difference is that I showed up, like 99% of this stuff is just showing up. Like I was saying with the example of the drummer before, you just show up, and if your pastor asks you to go lead worship for 5-year-olds in your church, you're like, sure, I'll go do that. That's an opportunity. And then, people notice that stuff when you are willing to do more, what the world sees as like less priority stuff. You go do that. God actually sees it as a high priority, but maybe as the world, you don't think it's very important to go lead worship for 5-year-olds. But if you do that, everybody notices. Pretty soon you'll be doing youth group, you'll be doing adult church, you'll form a band and go to other countries. Like, I've done everything from playing youth groups, camps, homeless shelters. I've even played in a public school in Australia. And it's just because I showed up, and one thing led to another, and it turned into bigger stuff. So I would say just be available. Don't think anything is beneath you. Just show up. And, that's probably the most valuable thing you're going to learn as a worship leader. And along with that, like, the more opportunities you get, it forces you to get better, because if you're going to be playing at a higher level venue, you're going to have to get better and rise to that task. Whereas if you never play with that, you don't have a great excuse to just really buckle down and put in that work. So, the Bible talks about, precept upon precept, glory upon glory. And that's what it's talking about. You're just adding to your skills and what you can do in your life.
Yeah, man, those are good tips. Good stuff. So back to how a new worship leader, like, they face a lot of overwhelm. And I think that overwhelm can be debilitating and kind of, make you get stuck. So what's a good way to overcome that overwhelm?
Well, a lot of people don't have a opportunity to do this, but playing with an experienced band helps a lot. If you're a new worship leader, let's say you're like a singer, or you play an instrument and you sing, it does help to have like a really good backup. Like, I've played in bands where they're like basically semi-pro to professional level, and it's crazy how easy it is to sound really good when those guys are your backup. So on the other hand, though, I've been, as a really experienced worship leader, I've had a band that's just not good. They're beginning. They're either beginning or they don't know how to play the style that I want to play, and it's a train wreck. Even though I myself, as a worship leader, am pretty experienced. So I would say, as a new worship leader, it's very hard for you to get up with an inexperienced band behind you and not be overwhelmed, because you're going to feel like there's going to something be going wrong every 5 seconds. And there probably will be with everybody that's super new. Sometimes that's unavoidable. And, if you just formed a band in your youth group, and there's like literally, you guys started playing 5 minutes ago, you just might not have that. But if you do have the opportunity for some kind of mentorship in your church, say, hey, can I go lead one song with you guys, or can I rehearse with you guys and just lead one song, even if it's not in front of people? That's a good way to improve your skills as a worship leader, but not have to worry about all, like, some of the other details that goes behind it. So.
Yeah, man, that's good stuff. And something I honestly had never thought of, but thinking back, like, that would have been really nice to, even just rehearse with somebody who's more experienced than me. The mentorship is a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I'd like to add to cut the overwhelm is to take things a week at a time. Because sometimes you go and learn from the bigger churches, the bigger worship teams, and they're planning 3 months in advance and all this stuff. And you're like, oh, well, that must be what I need to do. But I would kind of say, no, just start off taking it a week at a time. That's how I always did it. I was always thinking about the Sunday that's coming up and not any further ahead than that. And that was just to cut my own overwhelm. And also, when you're learning new things, learn one thing at a time. Just kind of write yourself out a list. It's I'm just going to improve this one thing at a time. I'm kind of like a 1 week at a time and a one thing at a time kind of person, because it usually works well. Sometimes you need to plan further in advance than that, but most of the time, I think the 1 week at a time strategy works well.
I think that's really good, because you can get really overwhelmed looking at these high profile churches or worship teams or worship leaders. How are they, how is Lincoln Brewster soloing, a million notes a second and singing at the same time? I need to learn. No, you don't need to learn to do that. Play it in A chord first. And then, maybe someday you'll get there, but, start with the basics. Yeah. So it's really easy to get overwhelmed that way, but, taking it one step at a time, like you said, is key.
So I want to just throw kind of a bonus question in here. Maybe we have a seasoned worship leader that's listening right now and they're like, oh, this is great stuff. I can relate to it. But I want to give them something tangible to kind of take away from this podcast. So let's talk about when you're bringing a new worship leader onto your team, what's the best way that we can train them and help them to win in their position?
Well, one thing that we did was auditions, because you want to make sure they kind of have the basic skills. And if they don't, then, you have to back up a step. It's okay, well, maybe we don't want to have you fully lead in front of people yet, but maybe we can do a rehearsal with you. So you kind of have to gauge where they are first. So that's probably the first thing I would say, is just to kind of get a gut check of where they are musically and skill wise, and also spiritually. Try to dig into that. Where are they? What's their motivations? Why do they want to start leading worship? Is it truly just, hey, I just want to be up in front of people? Or is it I have this calling? If it's, I have this calling, who are you to stand in the way? You need to get them up there. That's a story of one young lady. She was probably 30 when she started, but she's I just felt God called me to start leading worship, which is pretty unusual at the age of 30. Usually it's much earlier than that. But I was hey, who am I to stand in the way? So I'll kind of describe the process that we took her through. If that situation happens, it doesn't have to be an older worship leader. It could be any age, because we've done this with 14-year-olds too. So what we do is do a co-leading situation where we'll have maybe a 4 or 5 song set. We'll bring them up and we'll say, and we'll give 1 to 2 songs. Usually maybe it's 1 song during the Sunday service to start. And so the main worship leader will do a couple songs, get everybody kind of warmed up. And then it'll be kind of this softball where you just throw the new worship leader a really easy softball for them to knock out of the park. Right. And so everybody's warmed up, everybody's worshiping. And then we transition to a new song. It's not the main worship leader singing that one, but it's the brand new 14-year-old or 30-year-old worship leader who's never sung in front of who's never maybe done this before in front of people, and it was the first time. And then they, lead worship. Obviously, you've rehearsed before that point, so we know the structure of the song, and there's no surprises. They're not going to be doing this 10-minute rendition of some crazy song going all over the place. We just keep it really simple for that first time. So once they do that song, then the other worship leader takes over and does the rest of the service. So it's very very low key for that new worship leader. They're not feeling like they have to carry the entire service, because that is very difficult to get up there and welcome people and, do the transitions and stuff. So we're taking care of all that. All they have to do is sing us 1 to 2 songs. So we've found that works pretty well to incorporate a new worship leader. Obviously they have to have the skill level to even go that far. But if you can, figure out that they do have that skill level, then you can bring them up and just do that co-leading situation. And eventually, they're doing maybe 2 songs or 3 songs during that service. And eventually they're doing an entire service on their own, maybe with the main worship leader as an instrumentalist, just in case something happens, they can kind of keep things going. But it's just baby steps into that worship leading role. I think it's a mistake just to, unless they're super experienced and already, and they just come to your church all ready to go, to throw them up there and just say, "Okay, lead a whole Sunday." That's really scary stuff. So that co-leading idea has worked pretty well for us.
Good stuff. I like that. Baby steps, kind of like the one thing at a time. Yep. Keep it easy. Well, man, Tim, this has been so good. Thanks so much for taking your time to be with us here on the podcast. What's the best way for people to stay connected with you?
Well, check out worshipdeeper.com. Check out how does the Bible define worship? We'll throw a link. I think, Kate, you're going to throw a link in the show notes and all that. So that'll be there. Another thing that I like to share is just a book. I spent quite a lot of time last year writing a book called Learn to Lead Worship in 14 Days. So this is a fast track to leading worship. I don't know if everybody's going to be able to do it in 14 days, but it's basically breaking up starting to lead worship into 14 steps, all the way from never having played an instrument before to leading your first worship time, which is a huge amount of learning, which could take longer than that, but it's basically a kind of a 14-step program to get to that point. So I kind of break it down. And usually I sell the book for $10, but anybody that emails me and says, "Hey, I heard you on Cade's podcast," I'll just email it to them for free. It's just a PDF, and then I'll include some other resources like I think I have like a relative chord chart and some different other stuff in there too that might be handy as far as like theory and just learning the basics of music and different things like that. So I think there's like 4 PDFs that I'll just email. So just like email me, tim@worshipdeeper.com, and I'll send that to you free.
That's awesome, man. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah.
And you also have a podcast. I know that you haven't put out new episodes much this year because, COVID kind of slowed all of us down, but you got some great content on there. So tell them about that too. Yeah,
it's called the Worship Leader 101 podcast. And so my first maybe 30 episodes or so are just like, how do I get started leading worship? It's designed around, helping new worship leaders get started. And so it's really basic stuff. I know a lot of podcasts can get pretty technical, like how do you set up lighting at your church, or like how do I play with multi-tracks and stuff like that. And maybe you're not at that level. But this is just like really basic building blocks of how to get started leading worship. And then like in the later episodes, I start interviewing, worship influencers and people who have had a lot of time under their belt as a worship leader. And so there's stuff to learn there too. But yeah, check out those first 30 or so episodes if you're just starting out. They're on there. You can just download them and binge listen to them if you're really curious about how to getting started leading worship. So it's a great resource.
Awesome. Well, don't miss this opportunity to connect with Tim, get his book, go listen to his podcast, go to worshipdeeper.com, check out everything that he has there. And as always, thanks for being with us. We need your help to get this podcast out to everybody who needs it. So please leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're using. And don't forget to subscribe so we can let you know when the next episode comes out. So go implement what you learned in this podcast, and we'll catch you next time.